So it's been a while since I did an installment on this series, so I'm here again to try and determine what the best year in film is using a few factors. This time round we're going for a personal favourite of mine, 1976. So what we're going to do is look at a few notable films of the year and why they're so notable. We'll look at the Oscars that year, we'll look at the top actors and actresses of that year and I'll award who I think had the best year. Same for directors, we'll see who was topping the box office. I'll talk about some of my favourite foreign films and finally I'll give you my 5 favourite films of that year. Sound good? Okay, great. So, what are some notable films of the year 1976? Well, I think we're going to go with Rocky, Carrie, Taxi Driver, Network, and King Kong. First of all, Rocky. What is there to say? It's the best picture winner that beat out Scorsese, arguably in his prime. It's the first film I ever gave 10 out of 10, and it's one of my favourite movies of all time. Not only do I believe it's the best sports movie of all time, I think it's the best underdog story of all time. But what's so beautiful about this movie is that it isn't really a sports movie. It's a romance film wrapped up in a boxing blanket. It's incredibly personal and is notable for kickstarting not only the Rocky franchise, which is one of the most successful of all time, it also kickstarted Sylvester Stallone's career, who is one of the biggest actors of all time. Rocky has such a large footprint that its successor series, Creed, just had a film released this year with the biggest opening in the franchise's history. It's a great flick for sure, and if you want to hear me gush about it more, go and see my Rocky and Creed franchise ranked video. Next is Carrie, one of the greatest Stephen King adaptations directed by the great Brian De Palma, filled to the brim with iconic moments, performances and cinematography, but what makes it so significant is that it's the first ever Stephen King adaptation, which there are very many of, very famous ones too. Though my personal favourite would be Misery in 2017's It, Carrie no doubt lit the torch that would be carried on for decades to come. Then we have Taxi Driver, which there is really not much left to say about anymore. If you don't know what makes this film significant, then I'm not sure what we're even doing here. Scorsese is one of the greatest directors of all time, the greatest to some, and this is to many people his greatest movie, or at least his most iconic movie. There is not a film bro that hasn't been touched by it, there isn't a film student who hasn't studied it, and there's more than a few movies that have tried to replicate it, Joker being the most recent example. With more than a few iconic lines and scenes, this was the film to truly cement Scorsese as a director of Kubrick proportions. Next we have Network, which is earnestly maybe the odd one out here, but is ranked number 100 on Empire's 500 greatest films of all times list, and the quotes from this movie have been repeated to death, from UHF to Animaniacs to most recently in Better Call Saul. Its impact may not be so loud, it's on the surface of everything you may see, but it is embedded enough to sneak its way into every facet of entertainment. And finally we have King Kong, the version of the tale many Kong fans consider to be the best. Also known for its impressive and incredibly detailed sets and practical designs, this film, though at times sloppy, is a technical feat packed with brilliant performances and action set pieces that did extremely well for a monster movie in 1976. And with those notable films listed, whilst there are many more, we've got to move on to the Oscars now. So, the 48th Academy Awards were absolutely stacked with classics going at each other. For instance, for Best Picture we had Barry Lyndon, Dog Day Afternoon, Nashville, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Jaws. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest won maybe upsettingly over Jaws, though I think it was the most deserving personally. In fact, this movie swept in most major categories like Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor and Best Actress, also Best Adapted Screenplay. This film was an absolute juggernaut this year at the Oscars, however I'm glad to say Best Score did in fact go to John Williams for Jaws, a very deserving win and has aged like wine. Also, Barry Lyndon winning Best Costume Design definitely feels like a fitting win. All in all, I think it was a brilliant ceremony. There was very little to no upsets, the competition being so stiff that almost any winner in any category would have been satisfying. Also, fun fact, George Burns became the oldest acting winner at the age of 80 this year also. His record stood until 1989 after being overthrown by Jessica Tandy at age 82 for driving Miss Daisy, who then held it until 2021, finally being overthrown by Sir Anthony Hopkins at age 83 for The Father, who still holds it to this day. And speaking of actors, let's look at the actors who had a particularly good year this year and award who I think had the best year. Starting with Robert De Niro, with Travis Bickle, possibly his most iconic character of all time, and also an underrated performance in 1900, which we'll talk about later. Also, William Holden in Network as Max Schumacher is an all-time classic performance and definitely underrated in today's world, despite winning the Oscar in 1977 for it. Dustin Hoffman absolutely crushed it in All the President's Men and Marathon Man. Clint Eastwood had a particularly good year also with roles in both The Enforcer and The Outlaw Josie Wales, but I think I have to give this year to Sylvester Stallone. Though he only had one film this year, that film was Rocky, and his character work as Rocky Balboa was so inspired it gave him a franchise to last a lifetime. Also, his acting in the scene where Mickey comes to his house for the first time is the best performance of the year in my opinion. Absolutely heart-wrenching shit. And as for the ladies, Faye Dunaway in Network also winning in her category the following year. Talia Shire in Rocky as Adrian is of course a big soft spot for me. Sissy Spacek in Carrie is of course one of the most iconic horror roles of all time, but I have to give this year to the adolescent gem that is Jodie Foster, who at 14 was in Freaky Friday, Taxi Driver and The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane, which are all splendid films aided by genuinely great performances from Foster, who is not just good for her age, but is incredible besides it. So yes, I'm giving the year to Sylvester Stallone for the men and a young Jodie Foster for the ladies. Now, we best look at directors, and this is extremely tough because Brian De Palma created an individual and striking time with Carrie. Even with all the Stephen King adaptations since, this stands as a perfectly unique take on the horror legend's work. Scorsese, of course, with Taxi Driver for every single point I've already made about the film. Alan J. Pakula for All the President's Men, who somehow made the Watergate scandal the most interesting thing to a 22-year-old Brit with no interest in American politics. John Schlesinger created something that I can only describe as tailor-made, stylized, thrilling entertainment with his sleeper hit Marathon Man. This film is so unique it's hard to summarize all that's special with it in these short few sentences. John Carpenter also released an underrated banger very early in his career this year with Assault on Precinct 13, which, if you haven't seen, go see. It's one of the greatest director's most underrated efforts, but I think I'm giving the directing award to John G. Avildsen for, yes, of course, Rocky. I should have put a little warning in the beginning of this video, but this is kind of going to be a Rocky appreciation video, my apologies. But anyway, the intimate nature of every decision made in this film are half the reason I give it the 10 out of 10 that it is. There's a wholesome nature to the roughly edged filmmaking, and though I think Stallone himself has directed the following films in the franchise much better, I don't think this film would be anywhere near as great if Stallone had touched it himself. And with that said, let's take a look at the box office of this year, because Rocky dominated this year with a box office gross of $55.9 million domestically, which adjusted for inflation would be around $298 million this year. To put that in perspective, that's about as much as Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania and John Wick 4's worldwide gross put together. This film shot insane numbers just domestically that even these huge franchise movies couldn't even get worldwide put together. Talk about a smash hit. Next we have A Star Is Born, the awful one with Barbra Streisand and Chris Christopherson. Then we have King Kong, Silver Streak, All the President's Men, The Omen, The Bad News Bears, The Enforcer, In Search of Noah's Ark, and Midway. So though normally I like to look at this top 10 and see the trends of the year, unfortunately there doesn't seem to be much of any kind of trend. But I think that's indicative of the time and, well, brilliance of the year, and even though surrounding it, there was no trend. In the top 10 we have a sports romance film, we have a musical, a monster movie, a buddy comedy, a biographical political drama, a horror, a sports comedy, a neo-noir action movie, a documentary, and a war film. I said some of those completely weirdly. No films in this entire top 10 share any real genres with each other, whereas today, most of what you see in the top 10 are sequels of some kind, superhero movies and action comedies, often a combination of those three. So I think this top 10 grossing is quite interesting because very few of these top 10 films have made a lasting impression on Hollywood. It seems the films that are so great and famous from this year aren't the films that were popular at the time, aside from a few exceptions of course, so I'm proclaiming this year as the year for underdog movies, not only in general, but the highest grossing film is quite literally an underdog tale. And with all that done, it's time to move on to a new segment of the series, the top foreign films of the year. I have three I want to talk about, and the first of the three is the aforementioned 1900, which is an Italian movie starring the great De Niro, directed by the late great Bernardo Bertolucci. I personally believe this to be one of his best works, and it's always great seeing a famous English-speaking actor bleed over into international cinema, especially for roles in the works of legends. If you don't know, the film's a story about two friends who clash on political stances as they find themselves on the two separate sides of a class divide. This film is also, if you didn't know, roughly around 4 hours, but in its original version it was over 5 hours. But moving on to a shorter and more reasonable movie, we have OneArmed Boxer 2, also known as Master of the Flying Guillotine, and I think the name and poster should be enough to explain why this is so great, but if it isn't, let me just read you the synopsis on IMDb. After his students are killed by the one-armed boxer, a vengeful and blind kung fu expert travels to a village where a martial arts contest is being held and vows to behead every one-armed man he comes across. There is nothing more I can say about this film other than watch it. It's incredible and essential for any kung fu or Chinese cinema enthusiast. And finally, my last international pick from 1976 is The Magic Blade, one of the greatest choreographed kung fu movies ever put to screen, and opts in for a more interesting wuxia style to its approach, which had been a lost trend in the 60s until then. So if you couldn't tell, this really was a year for Chinese cinema. There were some more that I wanted to talk to, but we gotta move on because we gotta get to my favorite segment of these videos, which is my top 5 favorite films of the year. Starting at 5, with no surprise here, we have John Carpenter's Assault on Precinct 13. As already established, I think this is a massively underrated piece from the horror icon, and as one of my favourite directors, I simply could not list one of his movies in my top 5 of any given year where he released something. And number 4, we have Marathon Man, where Dustin Hoffman gives quite possibly his best performance, other than Master Shifu of course, in a film with weird government agents, Nazis and pure adrenaline. If you're into crime thrillers and have somehow missed this one, get on it as soon as this video's done, I promise you won't regret it. At 3rd, we have Carrie. As a horror fanboy, it would simply be blasphemous to not include a horror in my top 5, and this film is horror at its most pure. There are no cheap tricks, there are no rough patches, it is just simply a timeless display of understanding the source material that any remake or redoing of the same source material couldn't even hope to be half as great. It's iconic, it's suspenseful, it's Brian De Palma does Carrie. In 2nd, we have Mikey and Nikki, which is a crime drama I saw for the first time last year and actually features in my 2nd ever movie diary on this channel. So go there for my initial thoughts, but I explain this movie as sort of a uncut gems of its time, in the meaning that yes, it is high intensity and adrenaline pumping, but also in the way that there is no other way to end this story. The characters in the story are like a train barely holding onto the tracks that you know is heading towards a rickety bridge. It's a roughly directed but expertly acted time that I cannot wait to see again. It is one of my favourite films of all time. But in first place is obviously there is no other contender. Rocky. My first 10, my first tier, my beloved. Rocky is my favourite non-horror franchise, and this film encompasses every single reason why. The underdog tale, Stallone's writing and character work, every character in fact, the intimate nature of the story, and the tears that flow from my eyes when we reach the climax. Though I stress that Mikey and Nicky is the movie I'd recommend you most from this year, having Rocky come out this year is simply unfair to everyone else. And there we have it. The year 1976 in retrospect. A quick fun fact, but a lot of fucking great actors were born this year, like so many of my favourites and probably so many of yours too. And I think that's really the gist of this year. Though it works extremely well in a vacuum, this year can be best remembered for its lasting influence. From Rocky to Taxi Driver to Network to Carrie to King Kong, it all had such an impact on cinema to come, and I think that is the greatest argument as to why this may very well be the best year in film. So have you seen any of these films? If so, let me know what you think about them. Let me know what you think about this year. This video, I read every single comment and reply to as many as possible, and whether it's one from this fantastic year or not, as always, keep watching movies.